Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for When You Are the Whale, Growing Risks from Social Engineering Attacks as part of the LTRC Industry Insight Series. Our speaker today is Tomas Suros. Tomas Suros is a lawyer and technology advocate working at the intersection of law, IT, and client consulting. With AbacusNext since 2004, he currently serves as Global Product Marketing Director, guiding law firms through the process of identifying forward-facing technology options and ensuring the successful implementation of a tailored solution. With a background in practice automation and cybersecurity, Suros is dedicated to helping firms leverage technology to streamline their practice and protect their intellectual capital so they may remain focused on delivering the best possible outcomes for their clients. Thank you all for joining us. We'll now begin the webinar.
Fantastic. Thanks for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I appreciate you joining today. The topic at hand is really cybersecurity and how you as a law firm can both leverage technology that you have in place, but also increase awareness and have an understanding both personally so that your actions and kind of protections and instincts are highly tuned, but also ideally today we'll go over what social engineering really is, a brief history of it, and also kind of what we're seeing trending, because social engineering specifically is a way to exploit even robust protections, security protections at any size law firm, because social engineering really focuses the attack towards manipulation, deception, and acquisition of credentials or access, rights to your sensitive information, but it does it in such a way where it's, kind of circumvents any security protocols that you have in place, because really what it means is via psychological type of attack, someone is fooled into sharing valid credentials. So the actual access itself is performed or using those credentials. So we'll dive right in and we'll cover kind of the basics and then dive into towards the second half of the presentation, specific practical ways that you and your law firm can protect yourself and your client information. So I'd like to start with kind of setting the scene a little bit, or setting the stage. First, quote from former FBI Director Robert Mueller. I'm convinced that there are only two types of companies: those that have been hacked and those that will be. And even they are converging into one category: companies that have been hacked and will be hacked again. So clearly the threat is real. The FBI receives these reports both within the United States and keeps an eye for outside for all the different kind of attack locations, the attack types. And clearly their thought and belief going forward is that hacking is real, right? That there is a threat, that it's ongoing, and in fact in many ways it's growing. Another opinion comes directly from the American Bar Association, and that is data breaches and cyber threats involving or targeting lawyers and law firms are a major professional responsibility and liability threat facing the legal profession. Right? As custodians of highly sensitive information, law firms are inviting targets for hackers. So the threat is real, and law firms of all sizes are targets, simply because they have professional ethical responsibilities, and they manage, they hold, they must care for highly sensitive information. So the threat is real, law firms are in the crosshairs. Now let's take another perspective. This is directly from a convicted hacker. So Kevin Mitnick is famous. He's kind of a hacking savant. From his early teen days, he was able to, via instinct and trial and error, achieve pretty significant and impressive hacks of, at the time, cutting edge, thought to be state-of-the-art protected systems. So he was convicted, served some time, and now he actually operates as a consultant and a white hat hacker. And his quote that I think is instrumental today is, "A company can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on firewalls, encryption, and other security technologies. But if an attacker can call one trusted person within the company and that person complies, then all that money spent on technology is essentially wasted." And that's really what we're going to focus on today, is that type of attack. Social engineering that actually gets somebody to, in essence, hand over the keys to the lock that you're relying on for your protection. So what is social engineering? We'll start with kind of a general description, definition of it. It's the use of deception to manipulate individuals into divulging confidential or personal information that then may be used for fraudulent purposes, right? So that makes sense. It is a type of psychological attack that preys on fear, right? Or pride, or greed, perhaps, offering something free. If you share this information, you get a gift card or whatever, the case may be, or or kind of a desire or a bias to want to comply. Oftentimes there are attacks that come, and the real kind of guise there is, we're asking you to comply with our new IT directive, and please confirm your password here. Like, many people will follow those instructions with the goal being, well, I want to be secure, I want to follow, the rules, I want to comply, I want to respond in the right way. And also the other one is maybe a guilty conscience, like something that has been, or a series of emails that have been kicking around our organization have basically identified individuals and said, oh, we know you were watching pornography, right? Highly unlikely, but maybe there's the one person or who has a doubt or whatever. But any of those kind of psychological edges, appealing to something that you want, or scaring you, or offering something that could be a fix, an improvement, or something that you've thought about and wanted. So the psychology behind it is, it's a confidence game, right? But it's very effective, because what's able to do is enough information can be presented that makes enough sense to you. So oftentimes you are fooled thinking that you're doing the right thing. And I threw up this image here of the Trojan horse. Going back in history, this is like an early example of social engineering, where a magnificent statue designed to kind of commemorate or celebrate the epic victories in war and the military might is full of opposing military, the opposing army. And the real point there is that army, if they ran directly at the gate that they wanted to breach, they would not have been able to breach that gate, right? It was too heavily defended. But because they were inside of, a statue that was delivered as a gift to commemorate something, and arrived, it was sought after, they were able to then have the actual defenders open the gates themselves. So that's really the concept of social engineering. Clearly, it's been around a long time. And let's dive into some more specifics. Here are some statistics just to give us a sense of social engineering, its growth, its effectiveness. So phishing attacks, and we'll dive into what phishing is. I'm sure most of us have heard of it. They account for 90% of data breaches. So the idea of a data breach being performed by a hacker through some incredibly sophisticated, technological method, that's maybe 10% or less than 10%, but we know that 90% of data breaches happen because human error is involved. In other words, a person is fooled into handing over their credentials. Those credentials are used just like that person would have used them themselves to gain access to a potentially highly protective and secured environment. The next statistics is sobering. Social engineering attacks have grown 65% in the past year. And attacks have been measured every 39 seconds. So this is something that is growing. It is something that works, right, historically and presently. And it's something that, if a law firm is targeted because of your duty of care, your duty to protect information, you are that target, right? So it's growing, and you are ever more at risk. Also, something that I thought was interesting, and we'll touch on this a little bit later to give some concrete examples of how you can perform this, so a recent study showed that 97% of people were unable to identify a sophisticated phishing email. So if an email comes in and it has the appropriate logo, the appropriate language, it feels familiar, it looks familiar, maybe you've seen one just like it before, there are some ways, and we'll cover them, that may be used to help understand, or to help kind of tune your instincts to get a sense of, wait a minute, this doesn't quite click, this doesn't feel right. Unfortunately, we're not quite there. Obviously, 97% of people were not able to distinguish between a legitimate email and a phishing email. And the final stat we'll touch on is 30% of phishing emails are opened. Now, take that stat with a grain of salt, because open simply means it arrived and it may have been presented in your preview pane. So you didn't necessarily go and click and move down the path towards complying with the phishing email, but 30% means that those emails do arrive. They do get their way past, at least the initial gates that are there to weed out spam or identify known risks, right? So that's 30%. And then here's the real difficult stat: 12% 12% of recipients of those emails did in fact click on the file attachment or the link, the hyperlink that was embedded in the email. And that comes from Verizon's data breach investigations report that they publish annually. And we'll touch on Verizon a bit later because they actually were victims of a pretty significant breach that happened some years ago. And since then, they've actually, this is kind of interesting, they've released a yearly report. The report is named Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. I like that because if you search for Verizon Data Breach, their report is actually one of the first, if not the first result you get. So it's a clever way for them to kind of get ahead of the story. And also that report contains a great deal of useful information. And I recommend if you're interested in pursuing this or gaining additional information, it's readily accessible online, and they publish it on a yearly basis. Okay, so let's now take a look at some attack vectors. And attack vectors just means where these attacks often come from and what their type and how effective they may be. Phishing emails and fake websites are far and away the most used attack vector and the most successful, right? That's how you're able to get these messages to recipients with, enough information within them and deceptive, kind of design in order to get the results you're looking for. Pretexting is another attack vector. Baiting, quid pro quo, and scareware, and we'll touch on each of those with some specificity. So let's highlight the most used and something that you should be most aware of, and that is a phishing attack. So phishing is cybercrime in which attackers use email or malicious websites to acquire sensitive information by posing as a known person or entity. Now, the known person or entity could be Amazon, it could be Apple Computer, it could be FedEx, right? The goal is most of us have used those services. Most of us have received a communication from those services. And if a phishing communication tracks or matches something that I have, some familiarity with, or I certainly recognize the logo, that just increases the likelihood that I will treat that email in the same way I treated any of the previous emails. So it's kind of like the phishing email gains the trust of, that's been earned from my prior relationships with those kind of known entities or individuals. So what are some types of phishing attacks? A deceptive attack is kind of the highest level. This is the broadest base, and I touched on it a second ago. It comes, or it purports to come from a service you've used in the past, or the State Bar Association, or even a service that you pay for, your cell phone company, or your internet, ISP. All those different ways of making sure that the first hurdle, meaning your recognition, right? The impersonation of something that is the easiest way for you to treat it in a different way. So your alarm bells or your instincts or your caution maybe is down simply because you recognize the phishing email. The next level is a little bit more specific, or quite a bit more specific, but it's the most effective, and it's called spear phishing. And it is a phishing email, except the entity, your law firm, or you as a member of an organization is the target, right? Or is the source, right? So your recognition of it connects with you as a family law attorney or a member of the Milwaukee State Bar. There are different ways to kind of help the deceptive aspect of phishing be a little bit more specific to you based on your practice area, based on your memberships, based on what you've done in the past and connecting to that. The next level of phishing is whaling, and whaling is on the rise because it is so effective. And we titled the webinar today, "When You Are the Whale," and the whaling is a person, a specific named individual is the actual target of these deceptive phishing emails. So you are named in the email, right? And it purports to come from somebody that and it asks you to do something that you would normally do based on your role at the firm or your responsibility. So the idea of whaling is to take phishing and spear phishing to the very next level, where actually crafting that message to you, there's been research and work done behind the scenes to ensure that that email, when it arrives, will be treated by you with care, with a priority, And we'll touch on some of the other ways that, that whaling happens in a second. What that can lead to is a phishing type, which is a business email compromise, or BEC. The reason that is so devastating is after a whaling attack, let's say, where you inadvertently share your information, thinking that you were, that it was requested through proper channels. Once the other party has your credentials, they can then use your email account to send out messages that are identical to messages that you would send yourself. So there are a number of different layers here where, at the highest level, they're kind of casting a broad net, hoping to, trick or fool, a small number of people. Spear phishing, much more specific, and whaling actually personally choosing you as a target for these types of attacks. And then farming are IP redirects, and that's where a website that you may visit regularly, a domain that closely matches that website itself, or even at a kind of more sophisticated level, DNS pointers and things like that can actually have your response to a phishing email actually go to a website that has a URL that tracks and matches what you're used to. The look and feel is the same. You're actually not at the actual website that you expected. So that's what farming is, the idea of kind of tricking you into going to a site that you then enter your regular information in a normal process, but you're actually not where you thought you were. It's a different website. And then finally, phishing. This is phone-based deception, where email is a lot easier to send, but when you're really doing the whaling or spear phishing, the ability to call somebody and say, hey, I'm Joe from your IT team, or hey, this is your your voice over IP provider. We need to confirm XYZ. So it's the idea of literally getting on the phone and being able to try to convince somebody in their busy schedule, not via email, because there's no trace and they're not clicking anything. They're simply answering an incoming call. That's another type of phishing specific to phone-based deception. Now, let's look into whaling a little bit, because this is something I wanted to touch on today, because it really is affecting law firms and specifically attorneys and associates at those law firms. So whaling is a type of cybercrime that involves researching a target and crafting phishing emails that identify the victim by name, assume institutional knowledge for leverage. You can refer to certain things or purport to be somebody who the victim works with regularly, and then steal sensitive information from high-profile targets. Now, the term whale refers to those, the status of those high-profile targets, because oftentimes when you get the credentials of a whale in an organization, that person has broad security access. They can access subfolders, they can access systems, they can make changes, they can reset passwords, they can do those types of almost administrative level controls that most staff wouldn't have, let's say. So that's why whaling is so effective, and it's sought after, because once the actual kind of breach happens, the credentials you have give you almost unlimited access within that organization itself. Now let's take a look at a couple of spear phishing emails, which, as I mentioned earlier, are the most used attack vector. A good example is an email that you receive from the IRS, right? And it says there's missing information in your account, or it's incorrect. There's fear factor involved with the IRS. It would command your attention, and complying with that is what most people would want to do to avoid any additional kind of liability or problems. Or perhaps an email arrives from your bank. You recognize the name, right? You do your banking there, and it has a link that says, oh, there's some fraudulent activity. We're reaching out to protect you. Help us help you, kind of thing, right? So both of those kind of sources are recognized, and it just increases the likelihood that you would comply, right? And then finally, I pulled up an example from the Florida bar, where they put out an announcement saying, hey, dear bar members, in Florida, there have been phishing emails that have been sent out. They included an example that's getting ahead of it a little bit. I think that's a good effort by the Florida bar. The idea is, once you know that other members have been affected or have been phished, either successfully or at all, getting ahead of it, because your instincts are tuned, right? You're better prepared to deny, let's say, an attack if it comes, and you're aware of, if not the exact attack, the type of attack that you might expect, right? So that awareness, increasing our awareness, is tremendously effective. Now here are a couple examples of whaling attacks. So, You'll notice oftentimes they come sent from my iPhone, and urgent response is called out. They identify you, right? It's the salutation is very specific. There's a need expressed, and it's called a stressor event. It's like, time is of the essence, and this is an email example here on the right, going directly to Aubrey, right, based on her role and responsibility, and it comes directly from Isaac, somebody that she works with, somebody that she knows. Isaac is actually a person within the firm, and the fact that it was sent from the iPhone is almost it's a tactic, because the scrutiny that you give to this message is lessened because it comes from a mobile device. And you'll notice here on the left there, Gershon, right? It's Roger. Roger's the CFO, so position of responsibility, and the likelihood that that's where a request like this would come from. So anyway, this is the type of whaling attacks that we're seeing. So just be on the alert. Understand that, would this request come in like this? Is there really such urgency? Is this something that we do regularly in our normal course of business? So I just want to give you kind of eyes onto a couple examples of, and these are pretty straightforward and simplistic, but oftentimes the simple urgent message is the one that maybe requires the less scrutiny. So that's something to consider as you're protecting yourself against these types of attacks. So some other attack vectors that I want to touch on: pretexting. That's where there's a trust relationship established. And oftentimes it's not a request to go outside of your normal course of business. An example would be, confirm your email, or we've implemented our new security strategy against phishing. Here's one I've seen a lot. So it's almost like it's a deflection where, okay, so I can trust this because it's not phishing, because they're telling me in order to confirm my credentials, I'm complying with our anti-phishing policy. It's that type of psychological kind of trickery the manipulation that often makes this successful. Next is baiting. And this is something that we actually do internally within our organization as a way of testing, how our internal trading is effective, how effective it is. An example would be, recently, we distributed USB drives around the office. On the USB drive was a file, it was an Excel spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet was titled Executive Salary Bonus Structure for the coming year. Now, it's that type of file name that often makes anyone curious, right? Now the nice thing is every single one of those USB drives was returned without ever being inserted into a single computer in our organization. And that's not bragging. That's basically kind of confirming that the actual education that we conduct and that we test via these baiting exercises. But there are also successful kind of historic baiting attacks. One being a device or a network, let's say, that wasn't even connected to the internet. So there wasn't any type of kind of email attacks or any that wasn't a possibility. But via USB drives just left around the entrance to this secure facility, enough people grabbed them, enough people inserted them into their computer that the actual malware on those devices was automatically installed. So the baiting is an effective way. It's also called kind of honeypotting, but baiting is the common term to entice somebody to go outside of their training and their protections without needing to necessarily get them to click on anything. All they need to do is insert a USB drive. Quid pro quo makes sense. It's basically an enticing exchange. If you share those credentials with me, or if you sign up here using your credentials, you get a gift card, you get money, you get access, whatever it may be. But the quid pro quo is basically trying to build trust by saying there is a benefit for you performing the step that we're asking you to do. Another attack vector is scareware. This is something that pops up on your screen or lands in your inbox, and it says, quick scan shows that you have XYZ exploit. I'm here to help, or it comes from your IT team. We need to, eliminate this. If you get this type of email, respond accordingly. And then 2 minutes later, you get the email. So, or deactivation notices. If you don't perform this step, you will no longer have access to, the network drive or something like that, where it would affect, your ability to perform, your role within the organization within the firm. And the final thing I want to touch on, and this is low tech, like many of these are, but it's tailgating. And this is something we also do to test people. Somebody in front of the building, we have, key cards that you can't enter the building without a key card, that's tied to your access rights. But tailgating is where somebody's standing in front of the door, holding a stack of pizzas. It takes both hands to hold those pizzas. Hey, could you help me in? I can't quite reach my card. Oftentimes, where people want to be nice, we want to accommodate each other, but tailgating is a way to gain access, more physical access here. But it's something to think about, where asking somebody to hold the door for you, or asking somebody to open the door for you, or do you mind if I just if you just help me get in at this point? I left my card at home. My kid has it, or whatever the story is. Tailgating is another way to gain access, where you're not actually defeating the security. What you're doing is you're defeating someone's role in helping to protect, right, and enforce the security protocols. Okay, so some recent attacks, and we'll go through these pretty quickly. Target, as I mentioned, 400 million accounts were exposed, and it wasn't Target that was breached. It was a heating and air conditioning contractor that was working with Target and a large number of their stores that had access that entity needed. That entity was susceptible or fell victim to a phishing attack, gained the access credentials for the contractor, and gained the contractor's access to Target. And then once once the breach actually happened, gaining access to that information was something that was accessible within that network. Another important example: Google and Facebook. Over a 2-year period, a Lithuanian hacker fooled those individuals at that group to send wire transfers that totaled $100 million. So that's something to think about. Like, Google and Facebook have enormous teams of information security, professionals and CIOs and whatnot. But this was something where even at that level, it just takes a certain individual who didn't follow the protocol, or once you didn't follow it once, had in essence a new fraudulent protocol, where every once in a while, that process continued to the tune of $100 million over 2 years. Another example: the Democratic Party, leading up to the 2016 election. Fake password change notices for Gmail were sent to a number of high-level, Democratic members of the party, who, okay, it's time for me to, my password will expire, I got to change it. They went to a fake website, they entered their credentials, they clicked save, they sent those credentials, their current live credentials to a third party. And finally, Equifax. I wanted to dive into Equifax a little bit, just because there's not only did it affect 143 million people, but there were missteps in the incident response by Equifax. Specifically, the breach happened, right? There were up to 143 million people affected. Equifax created a website, EquifaxSecurity2017.com. That website was designed to help the public determine whether they were affected. You could go there, you could log in, it would give you a sense of, were you affected, were you not affected, and what are your remedies, what are the follow-up steps that you should perform. After the attack, a different website was created, SecurityEquifax2017.com. It was created to divert traffic, and it was created by a computer scientist, and it was educational in purpose, and it had a banner saying, from a cybersecurity perspective, you are not in a legitimate website. But Equifax, in its response, in its triage to its own breach, linked to the fake site, the fake URL, 3 times. So this is a misstep. It clearly shows how difficult it is, even in a large organization with a infosec and information security team like Equifax, to follow best practices. So 3 times in Twitter, in direct response to clients, customers who were asking for information about how do I protect myself? How do I ensure that my information isn't exposed, or how do I mitigate if it was? So in other words, this just shows how difficult it is, and having those right instincts, double checking, kind of the trust but verify model is really important going forward, specifically to phishing, whaling, and spear phishing attacks. Another thing I'll touch on, there were also many actual scams targeting Equifax customers. That often happens during natural disasters, where there'll be kind of fake charitable websites that are looking to, to phish and collect information, and oftentimes it's money that they're searching for at that point. Okay, so here's another better example of how to respond to a phishing, campaign. So earlier this year, the American Bar Association had phishing emails go out to some of its members. And you'll notice here on the left is an example of the fake email. It doesn't identify the member by name. It has that kind of stressor event where your fees are overdue, your membership will be revoked, act now kind of thing. No recipient name, sparse detail, doesn't know your ID, doesn't know your, your bar membership number and whatnot, and it has that "or will be revoked" threat. So the ABA received notice of this, and very quickly they tweeted examples of the fake email here up on the left and their actual email. And you'll notice the actual email is far more detailed. It identifies the member by name. It has their membership number. All of those bits of information are simply not something that a phishing email would have. So that's really, this is kind of an example, and I really think it is a better example of having the ABA having an incident response plan. Not that they were breached, but as soon as they became aware that their members were being phished, they shared this information. And once you have this information, and you know kind of the fake versus real, there's very little likelihood that you involve with a fake phishing email. So I like this example as just as kind of a how-to, where as an organization or as a law firm, educating both your clients potentially who may receive phishing emails from the firm, right, or purporting to be from the firm, or internally to the firm. Hey, if you see this, hey, if you receive this, this is not legitimate, and here's why it isn't. And then going forward, you have a better instinct. Your instincts are tuned to protect yourself. So some prevention best practices. Right? One of the first things I want to lead with is 77% of law firms lack an incident response plan. Now, an incident response plan is oftentimes something that you can have developed for you. I recommend law firms go through a cybersecurity audit, understanding where you are now, what are your best protections, where are your vulnerabilities, and what is the plan we can put in place. One of the activities I highly recommend, something that we do, I touched on it earlier, is the idea of penetration testing. It's to create or have a campaign of phishing emails sent inward to the firm, seeing who clicks, seeing who asks the right questions, seeing how long it takes, get a sense of where the kind of education, where the awareness, or where the instinct level is for everybody within the firm. Also baiting, maybe getting a couple of USB drives and putting an interesting named PDF or Excel spreadsheet on it and putting it around the office. So after training that you should never insert an unknown USB drive into any computer you own. And after phishing awareness, test it, send out some phishing emails, lay out some USB drives, get a sense of where we stand as a firm going forward. And it's not that difficult to do. There are also organizations that can help you do that. And we actually had a third party do some, white hat hacking and attempts against our infrastructures. It's a really good way to test and verify that internally within the firm, the awareness is consistent, the education is up to date, and instincts are tuned in a way to help protect yourself. So social engineering awareness training is key. Also, just some basic best practices. Do not open emails. Do not open attachments, and do not click links from unknown or unexpected sources. Another one is to never share company computer credentials. Just let me use your computer for 3 minutes. Never do that. The problem is your password needs to be yours. It needs to be secure. It needs to be private. And it's not something that multiple individuals should have access to, because it just increases the likelihood that the more people that know those credentials, the more likelihood that one of them may fall victim to a phishing attack and expose those credentials. And you may never know it until it's too late. Also, computers and mobile devices should lock after more than 5 minutes of inactivity. We do that, internally, of course, that if you walk away. Now, sometimes it gets, if it's every minute, you feel like, well, I'm just trying to think through this paragraph or whatever, and my computer keeps, locking me out. So find that kind of a happy medium, but I wouldn't make it more than 5 minutes, because if you step away just to go down the hall, grab a cup of water, or coffee, or whatever, your computer's exposed. And, and there's malfeasance that does happen within organizations as well. And also something I would recommend is, and this sounds a little draconian, but the zero trust model for authorized access. So instead of having a network where every user with their credentials has access to everything, instead kind of start with the zero trust, meaning every user should only have access to exactly what they need, right? So, and the benefit for that in our conversation today is, someone who should only have, a minimal level of access if their credentials were stolen, let's say, or exposed or breached via a phishing attack. That person with those credentials would also be limited. And I think that's why whaling attacks are really so devastating, because once you have credentials for somebody who can truly access and make global changes, you have the keys to the kingdom, and you can even create, or change passwords to lock other individuals out who are trying to access the environment and protect it after the breach. So the zero trust model is something I would recommend that everyone kind of at least consider, where dialing back access oftentimes is a very good way to increase the protections, even if a breach happens. Okay, so this is another important topic today. So phishing protection checklist, right? So we're looking at an example email here. Let's take a look at some of the items that are common to email, and how you can increase your scrutiny of specific examples of each of those items. So the from field. Do you recognize the sender? Is it somebody within the firm versus outside? And all of those are kind of adjustments to the levels of your, kind of scrutiny. Is it an unexpected email? Does it not make sense? Like, why would John send me this? Why would Nancy need to, to copy me on this? Does it come with an odd attachment where the attachment doesn't match the, or the name of the attachment, let's say, or even the file type doesn't match the content of the message itself? And now let's go to the to field. Is it just to me? Okay. Or am I CC'd with a group that either I don't know, that's a huge red flag, or doesn't make sense? Like, why would, these individuals who I recognize the names are certainly members of the firm, but they wouldn't be part of this type of communication, or I wouldn't be part of a communication, for that group. Those are also ways to kind of to hone your instincts. Also the date, was it sent during business hours? Did it come from the middle of the night? Any of those kind of inconsistencies or irregularities are good ways of determining, is this expected? Is this something that I would, receive in the normal course of business, right? Hyperlinks. Oftentimes emails come with hyperlinks. Are there spelling errors? When you hover over a link, I really want to kind of highlight that. Does it display a different URL address? Now, if we look at the example here on the left, you'll see there's from Trusted Bank an HTTP URL. But when I hovered my mouse over it, it popped up a preview of what the actual link is. The link doesn't touch or doesn't connect or doesn't follow what the actual kind of text for the URL is in the email. Now that's a common way to actually be able to identify, hey, wait a second, this isn't from FedEx. This isn't from Apple Computer. So that's a good way to kind of hone your instincts. It's an easy way to hover over a hyperlink and at least understand, oh, hey, this does match, right? This does follow. This is consistent. Also, is there a stressor event? Is there a threat or an enticing offer? Why would somebody threat? Why is there such a sense of urgency? Why would somebody give me, a gift card or whatever the offer may be? Also, grammar errors. Oftentimes, there's spellings or punctuation or plural versus singular or inconsistencies in the language itself. Oftentimes those appear, and if you read it carefully, and the problem is we all receive so many emails that oftentimes we're skimming them. But that's something I would, as you develop your instincts, make sure that you truly read and get a sense for sentence structure. Does this make sense? Is it consistent? Does it follow? Does it feel right? Also, is the email or is the person who's phishing me asking for personal information? That's an example where not many vendors will ask you for personal information. They will share with you information, right, as kind of a notification. But any personal information exchanged will be done after you've logged in through a secure, protocol. Also, trust your instincts and always err towards verifying. If you get an email from somebody who sent you a similar email, but there are enough discrepancies in it that it just doesn't feel right, pick up the phone, give them a call, right? Verify that this is in fact an email from the source that it purports to be from, right? So those are just kind of simple, but it is enough that if you have this type of awareness, many of these kind of discrepancies will actually pop up in phishing emails. And by doing that, it's a good way for you to have that type of awareness and, and share this information within the firm as a good way to help you and your staff be better, aware and better prepared for handling phishing emails. So quickly, some authentication protections. Obviously, use strong passwords. Do not reuse your passwords. I recommend using a password manager, which makes it easier to manage many, many different strong passwords that are required today. I do recommend changing passwords regularly, but there's some difference of opinion there. And I strongly recommend multi-factor authentication. And multi-factor authentication simply means your username and your password is one way of accessing your environment, right? But there's a second factor. So think of it as like your bank card, but your PIN number is required to either deposit money or withdraw money, or your doorknob lock and the deadbolt, right? It's that second key that if somebody stole the first key, they still wouldn't be able to access, your account or your location. So there's no single point of attack with multi-factor authentication. The reason that's so important or vital in this scenario, specifically social engineering attacks, is the second authentication factor is also notification to you of illegitimate access attempts. So let's say there was a phishing attack, and you did, inadvertently share or expose your information. If you have multiple factor authentication, when somebody goes to use those credentials that they stole from you, you still receive a notification of that access attempt. All of a sudden, you're like, wait a minute, I am not doing that. And you can deny it. By denying it, those credentials are no longer viable, right? So it's a good way for you to protect yourself. And I strongly recommend multi-factor authentication. It does require a second step, but oftentimes on your phone, on your watch, with one additional click, you can provide that second factor. And I think it exponentially improves your initial point protection, but also it can give you those notifications that I think are key. I also recommend endpoint malware protection, which is kind of an AI-based tool. It's behavioral based. So if somebody comes into your environment using other credentials and starts to copy off, large amounts of data or delete large amounts of data, this type of protection will identify that behavior, and it will stop it and notify. So it's another way, just like multi-factor authentication. If the initial breach isn't something we can always protect, what happens next is something that we can't protect against. And so finally, to wrap it up, some tangible cloud benefits, because I am a cloud advocate, and I think especially in this context, cloud security, built into the cloud is cybersecurity best practices at the infrastructure level, right? That means education and awareness during onboarding. As your firm moves to the cloud, this type of education is provided. There's 24/7 management and monitoring. So any irregular behavior or somebody accessing the environment in the middle of the night, right, is something that would raise a red flag, which is not something that most firms have now, where you're more reactive to any activity or lack thereof. Also, incident notification and response procedures are built into cloud platforms. Military-grade encryption is at the data level. There is backup and disaster recovery solutions included. Also, role-based remote access to your systems is easier, I think, to configure and manage when you're working with a cloud vendor. So that idea of zero trust and only giving access to the appropriate access to each individual based on their responsibility, that's easier to manage in a cloud. Also, there's no single point of failure. It does reduce IT burdens and increases your cloud security, and also ethical and professional compliance. How your data is stored, who has access to it. Exactly where it is and exactly who has access to it. And the other benefit is you can access it remotely from any device, right? So there are a lot of kind of advantages to the infrastructure, the actual way the cloud is designed. And we've seen many firms move to cloud environments for one, productivity benefits, but also security and really risk mitigation.
Okay, great. That is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank our sponsor, AbacusNext, and all of you for attending our webinar today as part of the LTRC Industry Insight Series. I'd also like to thank Tomas for presenting today. We will now conclude the webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.